Sally, and I recently returned from the Andes where I independently hiked the Alpamayo Circuit with a friend, and that's a trek that overlaps with the Santa Cruz trek. And I also hiked the Huayhuash Circuit with a guided group. So I'm here to compare those two things. I'm going to start by comparing the experience of hiking independently compared to hiking with a guided group. And after that, I'll talk about how these two hikes compare in terms of the scenery, the logistics, and other factors. So your first consideration might be safety, especially if you've never hiked at really high elevations. Something I want you to keep in mind is that just because you're with a guided group does not mean that you're going to be 100% safe. And in some ways, it's going to take away your agency to make the safest choices possible. 4 days after I came off the Huayhuash trail, somebody died in a campsite there, and they were a trekker with a guided group. They had elevation sickness symptoms that the guide likely didn't take as seriously as they should have. And I believe that's what's happened on Rainbow Mountain once or twice, where guides needed to make a certain itinerary. And so they had people crossing passes in the middle of lightning storms, and people have actually died because of that choice. If you are going with a guided group, you still want to be familiar with how to prevent and address elevation sickness symptoms. Our guides, surprisingly, also did not carry Diamox with them. And so the person in our group who came down with the symptoms had to rely on the other trekkers in the group for their extra Diamox. And I was really surprised by that because I did not go with the cheapest group. But I was also told that Diamox is hard to get in Peru. I don't know if that's true. But basically, I think if you go with a group, don't assume that you're going to be 100% safe. Make sure you're still, making smart choices and taking responsibility for your own safety. I learned that in this area of Peru, there is only one rescue helicopter. It is not normally used because it requires a lot of paperwork. I never saw it, and that is in sharp contrast to other places I've been hiking in the world, including the Himalayas, where getting a rescue helicopter is relatively easy. So make sure you keep that in mind too. If you need to be rescued, it's going to be on foot. So it's going to take longer. If you do go independently, you're going to want to bring those extra supplies like space blanket, extra food, and I would recommend bringing a two-way satellite device so that you can communicate with rescuers, and also so that you can make changes to your plans to help keep yourself safe and notify the people who are waiting for you to exit that trail that maybe you're going to take an extra day in order to stay safe because there's an incoming storm or there's a landslide or you're really tired, things like that. We wish that we had brought a two-way device. Whereas, of course, if you're with a guided group, you're not going to be so self-reliant. Some groups bring along a rescue horse where a sick person or someone who's not feeling well enough to hike, but maybe is well enough to continue to the next campsite, can ride that horse, and that did come in handy in my guided group. Myself and my friend who did the Alpamayo Circuit, both women, we actually felt quite safe the whole time. There was a couple of places we camped where there was a man living nearby who knew that we were there, and that made us slightly nervous. But we never had a negative interaction. We saw very few other hikers. We camped completely alone for about 4 nights, but we knew that no one was around. And there are no animal predators around. So just compared to, say, hiking in the Rockies where there are grizzly bears, there are cougars, there are black bears, I would say I don't think we were any more or less nervous. So the second consideration might be logistics. An advantage of going with a guided group is they will organize the transportation to and from the trailhead. Plus, of course, they're going to bring all the food, they're going to bring the tents. Just everything is going to feel a little bit more like a holiday for you because you're not going to be stressed about those elements of the trip. And you can just basically follow along after the guide every day. You don't have to look at the map or make any decisions. It is a lot more relaxing in that way. The flip side of that is you do need to follow along with whatever route they have decided on. A lot of people would prefer to hike independently because they get to set the pace and they get to decide where they're going to stop for lunch or to take some photos. And I've got to admit that that is a huge advantage of independently trekking. On the Alpamayo Circuit, my friend and I stopped all the time to take pictures, to rest, to snack. Whereas on the Huayhuash, we kept a very brisk pace. And that was unfortunate because some of us felt quite rushed. We felt like we weren't really making the most of our time there. we were getting to the campsites really, really early. Once it was even, 10:30 or 11 or something, we got to the campsite. And it was unfortunate that we felt so rushed when it was so needless. Now, that being said, we did have a guide at the back as well, who was lovely, and I realized I kind of just needed to be stubborn and just walk at a slower pace and not worry about the fact that there were people up ahead who seemed to be kind of rushing the rest of the group along. But it really did take away from the experience a bit for me. I would have liked to just sort of savor the day a little bit more instead of rushing to the campsite to just sit around for the rest of the day. And that's going to depend on what group you're in and how you respond to the elevation. I'm fit, but I felt very breathless. Even after weeks of being at high elevation, I needed to move slowly, and I wanted to avoid getting elevation sickness symptoms, which is what happens if you push yourself really hard at those elevations. Other groups might be a little bit too slow for your liking. We all respond to elevation differently. We all have different fitness levels. So it's definitely a downside of hiking with a group. I hate to say it. So I think the third main consideration is the experience of just hiking as part of a group and meeting new people and having it be more of a social experience. I found that when I was hiking with my friend independently, we actually didn't have a lot of opportunities to talk on the trail because we were breathing so hard because the air is so thin and because we had heavy bags on our backs. So I found the Huayhuash was a lot more of a social experience because, of course, there was more of us from all different parts of the world, and because I was actually able to chit-chat a bit more, and we also got to camp much earlier because we didn't have those heavy packs on, and so there was a lot more opportunities to get to know people. So depending on what kind of mood you're in, that might be a pro or a con, but it is pretty fun to get to know some people from different parts of the world. So food. The food on my guided trek on the Huayhuash was quite good, and there was a ton of options. Every meal time there would be 3 to 5 different dishes plus soup, and it was pretty good, especially considering it was made in a campsite using, very minimal tools. I was really impressed, and I am a pescatarian who can't eat dairy, and they customized the menu for me every single day. It was good, and I ate so much more than I did on my independent trek. Because we were only able to carry so much on the independent trek and we weren't making delicious food. We were eating freeze-dried food. Some of the food was more traditional Peruvian food. For example, we had a lupin salad. So that was also sort of an interesting aspect of the trip. If you like to eat and if you like to fuel yourself well for hiking, then a guided group would be a great option. We really struggled to get enough calories in on our independent trek because we were hiking for 10 days and we just weren't able to carry very much food. And that was a real problem for us by the end. The flip side of that, of course, is that every time you try a new dish that's been prepared in the campsite, you are maybe risking a little bit of food poisoning, especially in comparison with freeze-dried food. Another advantage of going with a group is they set up your tents for you, and they are big tents. And so just the level of comfort is definitely, it's higher. Both the Huayhuash and the Alpamayo Circuit, as well as the Santa Cruz trek to some degree, although it is shorter, are going to require that you have decent gear that is lightweight, that is warm, that is waterproof. And those things are hard to find once you're in Peru. So if you are traveling around South America on a gap year, I would say just go with a guided group because you don't have to worry about finding all those things. And you don't have to worry about the logistics. Whereas if you're coming for specifically to hike, then it might be worthwhile to actually bring your gear so that you have that freedom to hike independently. If you have the ability to hire a donkey handler, maybe you speak Spanish well, you have some contacts, then I would suggest hiring a donkey handler and doing either of those treks. That way you can do it at your own pace and you can be in charge of the itinerary while still having your gear handled by somebody else. And if you're going with 4 or 5 plus people, then I would definitely look into hiring a guide and a cook and some donkey handlers. I'm going to talk now about the Huayhuash versus the Alpamayo Circuit. And the Alpamayo Circuit, as a reminder, does overlap with most of the Santa Cruz trek. I did the 8-day Huayhuash circuit, which means we did not go to the hot springs. And the Alpamayo Circuit, we spent 10 days with 1 rest day. So altogether we hiked for 9 days on the Alpamayo Circuit, and 8 days on the Huayhuash circuit. The amount of elevation that you do per day on average on these trails is very similar. So on the Alpamayo circuit, on average, we hiked 757 meters of vertical. On the Huayhuash, we hiked an average of 734 meters of vertical. But I will say that what made the Alpamayo circuit feel a lot harder than the Huayhuash, in addition to the fact that we were wearing very heavy backpacks the whole time, is that the elevation gain on that circuit is very relentless. There's a pass every day. Whereas on the Huayhuash, there's a day right in the middle where we only walked up 84 meters of vertical, and so that was essentially a rest day compared to the other days. And that made the trip a lot more just sustainable. We weren't nearly as tired at the end as I was at the end of the Alpamayo circuit. We did walk up to the San Antonio Pass as well on the Huayhuash circuit, which is a day hike. You do not need to bring your gear with you, so that makes it a lot easier. Whereas on the Alpamayo circuit, we only did one small side trip up to a beautiful lake, but we brought all of our gear. The distances of these hikes are not long. The Alpamayo circuit, we walked 133 kilometers over 9 days. The Huayhuash, we walked 105 kilometers over 8 days. So these are not big numbers. You may be thinking, why can't you just do this in a few days? It's because of the vertical. It's so steep, and because of the elevation, you are moving so much slower than you would at sea level. So do not underestimate either of these hikes. These are challenging hikes. The Alpamayo circuit, I would say, was like a 9 out of 10 based on the fact that we had huge backpacks. We were bushwhacking, we were wayfinding, and it was so relentless. Whereas the Huayhuash I found was more of probably a 3 out of 10 in terms of exertion. But I think most people would find even the Huayhuash with just a day pack as part of a guided group is occasionally quite physically challenging. It is a lot of vertical, and it is sometimes quite steep. A huge advantage of the Alpamayo circuit over the Huayhuash is that it's not nearly as busy. So the 3 days approximately that you are overlapped with the Santa Cruz trek are very busy, but after that, you may be completely on your own for the whole rest of the trek. We crossed paths with 2 groups and 1 solo hiker plus 2 park rangers the whole rest of that trek. So that meant we went 3 whole days without seeing a single other hiker or tourist. We also had, I believe, 4 or 5 campsites completely to ourselves. The Huayhuash was busy the whole way, not so much on the trail where we were spread out, but the campsites themselves felt very busy. There are so many tents. There's just a lot of people everywhere. The bathrooms are disgusting. Now that might be an advantage if you are by yourself and you're hoping for safety in numbers. But if you're looking for some solitude and a feeling of real adventure, then the Alpamayo circuit definitely is the ticket. If you are hoping to go with a guided group, there is a lot more who do the Huayhuash circuit and the Santa Cruz trek than the Alpamayo circuit. That's partly why we did it independently. There just was not really any other option. Another advantage of the Huayhuash is that you can resupply en route. You go right through a village, there are shops there, they even sell some freeze-dried backpacker food as well as things like cookies and toilet paper. Whereas on the Alpamayo circuit, there's only one very small shop that has very little supplies, and you would have to take a combi to a city that's an hour away if you wanted to do a full resupply. So for the Alpamayo circuit, we had to carry 10 days worth of food, whereas if you did the Huayhuash independently, you'd only have to carry maybe 4 or 5 days before you could resupply for that final 4 or 5 days. You've probably been waiting to hear about how the views compare. I don't have a favorite. The Huayhuash has 1 or 2 views that are absolutely spectacular, off the charts incredible. In particular, the view from the top of San Antonio Pass, which is a little day hike that you can do as a side trip, is probably the most gobsmacking view I've ever seen in my life. However, the Alpamayo circuit has more variety in the types of views that you'll see because it goes through 2 different climate zones. So you're going to see more different kinds of plants, geography. Now on the Huayhuash trek, I'd say 6 out of 7 of the campsites that we stayed at had incredible views, but of course they were also a lot busier. Now on the Alpamayo circuit, I would say about half the campsites had incredible views, but half of those campsites we had all to ourselves. I mentioned the bathrooms before. The Huayhuash has flush toilets at every campsite, but they are horrible and I would a million times over rather just go in the shrubbery. So if you are grossed out by bad bathrooms, then I would actually steer you away from doing the Huayhuash. If you do a guided trek on one of those other treks, they will build a little toilet with a hole. You could probably also take matters into your own hands. Logistics. In terms of getting to the trailheads and back again, I'd say these are all roughly equal. The length of time is probably going to be a consideration for you. The Santa Cruz trek is a lot of bang for the buck for only 3 or 4 days. If that's what you have, I would absolutely recommend that. The part that we overlapped on, which was most of it, is really spectacular. If you like wild camping, then the Alpamayo Circuit is going to be the one you want to do. The Santa Cruz trek, technically you could wild camp too, but there's only so many places in between the more established campgrounds where you could realistically pitch a tent. The Huayhuash, you are not allowed to wild camp. You need to camp in those established campgrounds where there are going to be a lot of other people around you. The Alpamayo Circuit has a lot of ruins, so if you're into history, you want to see ruins, that's definitely the trek for you. And I really enjoyed seeing those ruins, even at 4,000 meters plus. Right as we were about to head over an epic pass, there'd sometimes be ruins right there, maybe a defensive point for the Incas. The Alpamayo Circuit requires some wayfinding and some bushwhacking and the ability to navigate. So you're going to want to research that route really well because unlike those other treks, it is not super well marked. There is places where the trails just trickle off to nothing and you're just navigating through different cow paths. So that's a disadvantage, but it also made it feel a lot more adventurous, and it's just kind of comes along with the territory. When you're hiking somewhere that very few people hike, you might need to do some wayfinding. I would not recommend either the Huayhuash or the Alpamayo Circuit as an independent trek to anyone who has never done independent backpacking before. These are not easy trails. These are really demanding. There are serious safety considerations. The nice thing about a guided group is almost anybody can do it. As long as you are of reasonable fitness level and you have done some acclimatization, anybody would be able to do the Huayhuash. If you are a beginner backpacker and you want to do an independent trek, I would stick with the Santa Cruz trek because it is shorter, it's busy, and if you get into real trouble, there'll probably be someone around who can lend you a hand. So at the end of the day, what do I think was the better hike? I honestly could not tell you. They're both spectacular in terms of the scenery. I do think the independent trek really had an advantage in the sense that there was nobody else around for a lot of that hike and it was very adventurous. On the other hand, doing the Huayhuash as part of a group was so much more relaxing, so much less exhausting, and it felt a lot more like a holiday. So I think it depends what you're looking for. But really, you can't go wrong. These are incredible hikes. So I hope that was helpful. I will see you out there.